Guys, I'm currently in Cannock Chase, and this place right here is where a hermit called Dick Slee used to live. Let's get into it. On Cannock Chase, in a quiet hollow near the oak edge of what we now know as Marquee Drive, there once lived a man who chose to step away from the world almost entirely. His name was Dick Slee. Before he became known as the Hermit of the Chase, he'd worked as a labourer for Squire Anson of Shugborough. By all accounts, he was a very shy and reserved man. Someone who kept to himself, spoke little and seemed content with very little beyond what he needed to get by. But over time he grew tired of service and sought something else. A quieter life away from people, away from noise, somewhere he could just exist on his own terms. So he headed off into the chase and settled in a small hollow, a place marked on old maps as a Dulham Cave, although locally it became known simply as Dick Slee's Cave. And there, almost day by day, he built a life from scratch. He carried bricks out from Shugborough himself, piece by piece, and constructed a simple hut. Around the hut he laid out a small garden, and over time he planted trees. Trees that are still standing today, firs, birch and mountain ash, slowly shaping the land into something that was his. The spot was sheltered, tucked beneath rising ground, with a brook running nearby. And for a man like Dick Slee, it was just what he needed and exactly what he was looking for. He lived quietly, keeping to his routines, and although he'd chosen solitude, he wasn't entirely forgotten. People in the nearby villages knew of him. There was a quiet kindness towards him. Mothers would send their kids out across the chase with small offerings, bits of pork pie, and occasionally custard, simple food but enough to help him along. And while Dick wasn't much of a talker, he accepted it. And over the time he became familiar, if not distant. He was the hermit of the woods. But despite this quiet connection to the outside world, his real companionship came from somewhere far more unusual. This companionship came from a hare. Somehow Dick managed to tame her and he named her Bess. And she wasn't just a passing animal that came and went. Every day she would return to his hut. In a life built on isolation, she became his constant, his routine, his company and his silent friend. And then came a day that changed everything. The chase wasn't just a place of solitude. It was also used for sport. Hunting parties would cross the land, and on one particular day, despite orders from Squire Anson that the greyhounds were not to be brought near Dick's dwelling, those orders were ignored, or perhaps forgotten. The dogs were set loose and they picked up the scent of Bess. What followed was instinct. She ran not away but back. Back across the chase and back to the only place she knew was safe. Dick's hut. Now Bess made it, but only just, and as Dick opened the gate to let her in, she collapsed at his feet. She was exhausted, terrified, and passed within moments. For a man who had built his entire life around quietness, routine, and the steady presence of Bess, it was devastating. He buried her himself in Vault Hill Woods, placing her in a small vault near his hut, a place he'd already prepared, intending one day to be laid to rest there himself. And afterwards he wrote a poem, simple but heavy with grief. Poor Bess, alas, is dead. Now it brought bad luck for me. She had no soul to save, yet Bess I loved to see. Each day she did around my humble cottage end. She was my sole companion and my silent friend. From that point on, something in him shifted. It was a kind of shadow that fell over the rest of his life. The quiet he'd once chosen began to weigh on him. The loss of Bess wasn't just the loss of an animal. It was the loss of the only real companionship he'd allowed himself to have. Not long after, his condition declined, and it was eventually decided by the parish authorities that he could no longer remain out there alone. Dick Slee was removed from the chase and taken to Rugeley Workhouse. And that's where his story ends. The hut he built and the garden he laid out, the life he carefully pieced together, all of it eventually faded. The structure of his hut fell away, leaving little more than bricks in a hollow in the land. But the story didn't disappear, because even now Dick Slee is remembered. Not as a labourer, not as a man of status, but as something much simpler and much more human. A man who walked away from everything, built a quiet life in the woods, and was undone in the end by the loss of the only friend he truly had.